Okay, the recording is up and running. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to episode 171, Wildlife of the Southern Region. We've got two really talented speakers today. Our first one is going to be Brandon Shad, and he's going to tell you the story of Region 3 wildlife, and Dave will come on after that. So with that, Brandon, tell the folks a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hi, my name is Brandon Shad. I'm the Assistant Regional Wildlife Manager for Region 3, and we'll talk about what Region 3 is and where it's located in just a minute. Previous to being the Assistant Regional Manager here, I was the Area Wildlife Supervisor out of the Rochester Wildlife Office in southeastern Minnesota, and I've also worked in Dave's neck of the woods down in Owatonna in the southwest region prior to that. So with that, we'll kind of get started. So Central Region Wildlife, which is also known as Region 3. Might have to, sorry, it took me a second to figure out how to advance the slides there. I'm not quite used to WebEx. So this is a broad overview of Region 3, which is our central region in the state of Minnesota. And Region 3 kind of follows what we call the transition zone in Minnesota. So there's a boundary between the prairie ecoregion and the forest ecoregion up in the northeast part of the state. And so Region 3 follows that boundary and kind of cuts diagonally from the southeast part of the state up to about the Little Falls and Sauk Rapids area up near St. Cloud. And we have 23 different counties that we cover. And there's something that's unique to this region is that we also have a population of about 4 million people within this region. And so that adds a lot of recreational opportunities and also some challenges with urban wildlife and things like that. We have 4 major units. We have Mille Lacs WMA, Carlos Avery WMA, Vermilion Highlands, and Whitewater WMA. And major units are large contiguous wildlife areas that are usually, tens of thousands of acres, 20 to 30,000 acres. And so those are really big kind of special units that we have. And then we also have 5 wildlife areas, and our wildlife areas are conglomerations of counties that have smaller wildlife management areas, from maybe 40 acres to a few hundred acres in size, kind of scattered a little bit more diffusely throughout the area. We manage 238 wildlife management areas with a total acreage of over 181,000 acres. We have 15 game refuges, and we have 203 lakes that are either wild rice lakes or designated wildlife lakes that we manage for wildlife. So this is just a broad overview of our areas. Our wildlife areas include Little Falls, Sauk Rapids, Cambridge, the North Metro, which includes Carlos Avery, the South Metro, which includes Vermilion Highlands WMA, Rochester, and Whitewater WMA. Our major units, as I mentioned, are the 4 I had discussed previously. And there's some links here to where you can look at a map of the wildlife managers with their contact information. If you're wondering if I'm in Washington County, who's my local wildlife manager, these links should take you to both the wildlife manager and the assistant. So as far as some wildlife highlights in Region 3, being on that transition zone, we have some very productive areas for many types of wildlife, both game and non-game. And so we have a really high abundance of a lot of species like wild turkeys and white-tailed deer. And with those high populations come some challenges. We have a lot of urban nuisance issues, particularly in the metro area where it's a little bit more challenging to manage wildlife through traditional means. Regulated hunting is generally how we manage deer numbers in accordance with our population goals, but in urban areas, for a variety of reasons, that may not be a tool that's easily used. We also have a very high diversity of game species. We have everything from prairie species like pheasants to ruffed grouse, and so there's a lot of opportunities. And we also have some exceptionally high biodiversity. Southeastern Minnesota, down near like Rochester and Winona, is actually has the distinction of having the highest biodiversity in the state. And so there's also many rare plants and animals present. Some other interesting things that we have going on are we have some recovering and expanding wildlife populations. Some notable examples that I listed here are black bears. And so that picture on the left are reported bear sightings outside of the primary black bear range. And you can see all along that line with the kind of core black bear range, there's a lot of sightings, but then down in southeastern Minnesota, we have quite a few as well. And there should be a link coming into the chat where you can actually report bear sightings outside their range, and we like to get that information. The map on the top right is locations of bobcats in southeastern and southwestern Minnesota. And bobcats were extirpated long ago, and we're seeing a real resurgence in their populations recently. And we're actually doing some pretty interesting work in coordination with the university to determine where these cats are coming from, if it's from our northern forest zone where bobcats are quite abundant, or from further south, like in Iowa, where they're actually making quite a comeback as well. And fisher are a type of they're a very large member of the weasel family, and they're also becoming much more abundant in southeastern Minnesota and expanding their range. So wildlife management areas are the areas that the section of wildlife manages for outdoor recreation and wildlife habitat. Most are open to hunting and other wildlife-based recreation, such as hunting, fishing, hiking, foraging, wildlife viewing, and other activities. They're found throughout the state, both in the forest and grassland area, and many also are pretty heavily focused on wetlands. And here I'm just showing off some of the cool stuff that I've found this spring so far on some of our wildlife areas. But there should be a link in the chat that'll bring you to a page about our WMAs, and we have a WMA finder that can help you look up WMAs by name and location. Another great tool is the Minnesota DNR Recreation Compass. This is a free app that's available on our website, and it shows the boundaries and is an interactive tool to look at not just wildlife management areas, but other state lands that are available for recreation throughout the state. You can toggle back and forth between a map view and aerial imagery, and it'll show state land ownership, trails, oftentimes parking lots and boat ramps and things like that. And that can be a really useful tool. So one of our, I'm going to go through some of our primary activities in Region 3 now. And a big part of Region 3 being on that transition zone is forest management. And there's a lot of different aspects of forest management. We might do things like timber thinning to allow more sunlight down to the ground and promote the growth of plants and berries that are beneficial to wildlife. We might do a timber harvest to regenerate, say, a aspen stand and make better brood rearing cover for ruffed grouse or better browse for deer. And we also do a lot of prescribed fire, particularly like in our oak and pine communities. And that can be a really effective tool for recycling nutrients, as well as controlling some invasive species like buckthorn and exotic honeysuckles that can be problematic to control. We also do a lot of just without fire invasive species management. On the bottom left there is a buckthorn project that we completed recently in Goodhue County. We also do some underplanting where we'll plant oak and hickory seedlings, typically prior to a thinning or a timber harvest to help regenerate the stand. So we ensure that as those oaks age and start to die, there's young trees to come in and continue providing that habitat. And we also do some restoration. Sometimes when we acquire properties, there's cropland on them, and we'll take a look and see what's the best fit for that site for habitat. And direct hardwood seeding is a good example where we'll take acorns and disc them into a field, and then which is what they're doing on the top right. And then on the top left, you can see it's a little bit hard, but there's a bunch of little tiny oak trees to spring after a direct seeding that we did. We do, as I said, we have over 200 wild rice and designated wildlife lakes in the region. And so we do a lot of wetland management, whether it's prescribed burns, water level controls. We do summer and fall water level drawdowns to mimic the natural hydrology of a lot of those wetlands, which has been altered, pretty drastically due to increased drainage and the way our systems kind of work now. And those can be used to either stimulate plant growth or control invasive fish like common carp that can be detrimental to those systems. And we also do a lot of beaver management, because when we get these water control structures, beavers just love to plug those up with sticks and mud. And on the top left, there is an example of what's called a Clemson leveler, where we kind of trick the beavers and we put the drainage mechanism way out into the lake, and they can't figure out quite how the water's getting out. And so it's it makes it a little bit more difficult for them. Again, wild rice management, a lot of that is managing for stable water levels. During the stage of growth, when wild rice is at what's called the floating leaf stage, it's very susceptible to flooding, and it can get uprooted pretty easily. But wild rice is a really important resource, both for wildlife and culturally for a lot of people as well. Prairie and brushland management, being on that transition zone, we have a lot of prairie and oak savanna type of habitats. And so using prescribed fire to keep out the trees and the encroaching brush is an important tool, and to recycle those nutrients and promote flowering in our forbs and other flowering plants. Taking old grassland, many of the early CRP plantings were invasive non-native grasses and like smooth brome, and they don't provide super great quality habitat, but converting that into diverse native prairie restorations. And invasive species management can be pretty important. There's a lot of different invasive species, and being kind of on that eastern edge of the state, we tend to run into them before things tend to move from the east, it seems like. And so we do a lot of that. And also some woody removal. Because of the rainfall that we get in the transition zone, which is generally a little bit higher than in western Minnesota, we have a lot more issues with woody encroachment because that really favors woody species. And so, doing brush mowings or hand cutting or things like that can be pretty important. We also do a lot of wildlife surveys for a lot of game and non-game species, including rough grouse drumming surveys. Some folks help with woodcock singing routes. We do have sharp-tailed grouse in east central Minnesota, although they're struggling a little bit right now, but we count sharp-tailed grouse at their leks in the spring. Our August roadside surveys are targeted towards mostly pheasants and other prairie game birds, but we also count things like sandhill cranes and white-tailed deer. And we also do some fur bearer surveys, which are generally track counts and fur bearer registrations for regulated species like otter, bobcat, and fisher. And some offices do some waterfowl counts during the fall migrations. I won't spend too much time on this. We spend a lot of time on it in real life, though, and that's facility management, making sure that these places are ready to use, good parking lots, access trails are in good shape, and that we have good signage at them is a big part of our workload. We also do a lot of acquisition, which is acquiring new lands, oftentimes using outdoor heritage funding, which is from that amendment that was passed that provides some percentage of tax dollars for wildlife habitat and benefit. Some good examples of this are that are pretty recent are Moon Valley WMA, which is just northwest of Rochester in Olmsted County, and it's about 420 acres and has about 2.5 miles of river frontage on the Straight River. And Keystone Woods WMA in Washington County, which is about 1,800 acres, and will be transferring hopefully this fall to the DNR. And one thing that's really cool, excuse me a second. One thing that's really cool about these acquisitions is, as I said, we have 4 million people within our region. And so they're very close to home and offer great opportunities for people that aren't too far away, where they can get out and see wildlife and participate in outdoor recreation. And we do much more. A lot of disease monitoring. Some current ones that we're doing are for chronic wasting disease and avian influenza. We do a lot of assistance for agricultural producers when they're having damage issues due to wildlife. And in the central region, we also have a lot of accessible hunts, working in coordination with organizations like Capable Partners and others. And so being close to the metro areas really helps us facilitate that. All right, now I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Dave Trauba, and I'll let Dave introduce himself for Southern Region Wildlife.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. Great job. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Dave Trauba, I'm the Regional Wildlife Manager. You know, a little bit of story on my career. I actually did my graduate work on blackberry ecology up on the Apostle Island National Lakeshore. So my dream job was to be a Northern Forest Wildlife Manager. And that actually took me to Ely, Minnesota, where I was living the dream, also doing blackberry research with the Forest Service. And then one day my wife said to me, you know, Dave, we're really poor, get a real job. So I started applying to find that real job, and fate took me down to Region 4, which we call the Southern Region. And I actually landed at a major unit called Lac Pearl WMA, and I will talk about a little bit. And that's really where I fell in love with the prairie wetland landscapes of southern Minnesota. And Lac Pearl is most famous for its Canada geese. That was central in the restoration of Canada geese to Minnesota, not only bringing back giant Canada geese, if you will, but also migratory stopovers. So just an abundance of wildlife. I was there for 24 years. I was very happy. And then I was tapped on the shoulder one day about, hey, what about, you know, taking on the regional wildlife manager job and overseeing the 32 counties? And I lost a little bit of sleep, but I said yes, and I loved every minute of it. And then just about a week ago, I was tapped on the shoulder again saying, hey, how about being acting section manager? So now I'm stepping in for a few months, overseeing all the wildlife operations in the state, and I'm going to enjoy that, I think, just as much. Brandon, next slide, please. Yeah, so, you know, best for last, we're called Region 4, Southern Region. So we cover, again, the 32 counties in the southwest part of the state, as you can see on the left-hand corner. And then you have on the right, you'll see we have 8 what we'll call wildlife work areas. And that geographic model actually goes back in Minnesota to the 1950s. That's when we really started up that kind of that area wildlife manager being out in the field. And then they have a certain number of counties. And I'm not going to list them all here. But as you kind of go to west to east, in the west, we have fewer counties per area staff because we tend to have more WMA and WMA acres. And then as you move further east, the WMA acres and the number of WMAs are a little bit less. So in the Nequit-Owatonna area, they have a 6-county work area to cover. Whereas if I look at the Marshall work area, they have a 3-county work area. Again, the Marshall work area would have over 110 wildlife management areas to take care of. In the Owatonna area, it's probably around 70, something like that. So that's how we're kind of geographically based. Brandon, next slide. Yeah, you know, I'll highlight here, you got the links to look at our contact map. Make good use of them. Area wildlife supervisors are listed in the bold here on the left-hand side. You know, I'm really privileged, I guess, when we look at the regional team. We have a well-tenured staff of supervisors, area wildlife staff. Janine Borland's been with us for over 40 years. I think the most least seniority would be to Brian Nyberg, but that's probably going on 10 years. So a well-tenured staff, they know their jobs, they're all passionate about it. It's just really a pleasure to supervise all those staff. But again, we're going to have some retirements coming up, so that'll bring transition. But on the right-hand side, you know, you look at our assistant area wildlifers, our techs, and our office and administrative support staff. And again, just a wonderful team, very talented individuals coming up that I think are going to make great wildlife supervisors in the future. Brandon, next slide. So, you know, land management, you know, so a few folks were on the Region 1 and 2, right? They're a little bit blessed with, you know, more public land base. If I look at Region 4, our public land base in most of our county is, you know, in some counties, it's less than 1% of the county is in public land. You get towards the top here a little bit up in the Lackawanna County, then maybe, you know, 3 to 4% of the public land base. So backing up even more, we have just two ecological provinces, like Brandon was talking about the transition zone. Really, I would say 80%, the western half, even in the central half of Region 4, is the Prairie Parkland province. It was all just wide open tall grass prairie within thousands and thousands of bedded wetlands and shallow lakes. As you move east into Region 4, then you got that, you know, the oak savanna communities, the big woods, if you will. And there we do a lot of oak restoration work. So just two ecological provinces. But we have 710 wildlife management areas, so we don't have the most WMA acres. That's around 200,000 plus and growing. But we have the most WMAs anywhere in the state. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. Brandon talked about the rice lakes. We don't have so much wild rice down here. We don't have the water quality. Maybe really never did. That was, you know, it takes a certain type of water chemistry for wild rice, but we do have the most, if you will, designated wildlife lakes or lakes designated for clean water purposes. And we have 74 of them statewide, and we have 25 state game refuges and such. We again will highlight there the one major unit, Lackawanna WMA. You can, that's kind of that tan color up in the northwest and upper Mississippi River Valley. That is, we just completed the master plan for Lackawanna WMA, and that is the only prairie major unit that we have in the state. So it's kind of unique in there. And within 1 hour of Lackawanna WMA, you have over 100,000 acres of of public lands, not just WMAs, but waterfall production areas as well. And I think at one time, this area was kind of referred to as the Serengeti of North America. If you look at the prairie and the wetlands, we would have had vast herds of bison, elk, you know, waterfall that, you know, they always heard darkening the skies. I mean, we at one time, that's part of the state, was able to produce more waterfall than some of the best habitat we have today. But things have changed. Brandon, next slide. So challenges and opportunities. All challenges have opportunities, right? So we are very an agriculturally dominated landscape, right? Mostly corn and soybeans. I would say 95% of our work area is devoted to those two crops. So that leaves around a balance of maybe about 5% in some type of natural landscape. And we have over 12,000 miles of rivers. But if you look, we have over 7,000 miles of open ditches and a lot of drain tile as well, right? So that has those ecological, right? There's all trade-offs on anything, but that has some ecological consequences, and that's where we really get, I think, into the opportunity that we'll talk about in a little bit. Region 4 is a hotspot for renewable energy, wind turbine development, solar development, right? And that's all positive to kind of move toward the carbon-free footprint. But that does have challenges for wildlife conservation, landscape planning that I think, yeah, that we are, you know, very much working through. And then this goes back to my days in college, but Wildlife 101, the best soils can grow the best wildlife. And that's very true. I mean, we have the best soils, so we can grow very healthy and abundant wildlife. And that's really set about by human motivation, as us humans want to leave room on the landscape for wildlife, we can do so. And And again, that gets back to the Serengeti of North America. Brandon, next slide. So core work, I put this at the front, restoring our wildlife heritage, and that really gets into acquisition work. That is what motivates our staff, and much of the acquisition work in the state has been focused in the Southwest and building on our heritage. And down in the middle there, you're going to see Save the Wetlands program. And that started in 1951. I just want to let the people on that. That was a hallmark conservation program and visionary in the time. Again, 1951. And that was just literally, they went out and they saved the wetlands from drainage, because at that time, there was large scale county ditch to digital ditch projects coming in that were, if you will, draining lakes, draining lots of wetland habitats, just the reality of the times. And our managers were very concerned, so they started that program. And back in those days, we just bought the wetland. We didn't have any upland habitat. And really, that was the nucleus of our WMA system. And since then, we've been adding on there. So when I look at the left-hand screen, that's Whitefield WMA. That shows 3 different acquisitions going on. One that goes back into the late 80s, in the middle, if you will. And then you can kind of see the blue to the northwest and then the water down. And it really built onto that. So many of those Save the Wetland areas started as Tract 1, maybe 80, maybe 40 acres in size. And now some of those areas are over 1,000 acres in size. And we're really building the integrity of our WMA system. And it all started by visionary managers in the 1950s. And that's what excites us. When we put water and grass back in the landscape, we're holding that water in the landscape that has so much from a flood mitigation standpoint, groundwater recharge, not to mention the wildlife benefits, bringing wildlife back. On the right-hand side is Schlesinger WMA, and that's another classic example of the work we try to do. We have a WMA to the north that was small, a waterfall production area to the south, and in between, that section of land came up for sale. Ducks Unlimited was able to move on it. So when you see that thing 17, that's a square mile of land. Now that's pretty rare for us. Most of our acquisitions are smaller. But if you look at that, that's over 22 wetland restorations on that property. We did some stream restoration work on that. And then the prairie reconstruction work is sculptured. I mean, so it's dry prairie, mesic prairie, wet prairie, over 70, 80 different plant species. I never dreamed we'd be doing that type of work. I mean, when you walk out there, it is just absolutely loud with pollinators. You hear all the buzzing, the insect life, waterfall return, deer, pheasants. It's just the type of work we love to do. Next slide, Brandon. And, again, Brandon touched on this. For us, it's very much prairie, wetlands, and oak savanna. I don't have a good picture of the oak savanna. But really, I think our prairie reconstruction, restoration of prairies is relatively a new science. I would maybe say 30 years. And I look back at my tenure, I mean, I can remember back, we're planting 5 grass species, and that was like a big deal because it used to be 1 grass species we're planting. Now today we got flowers blooming in our, that we're adding flowers into our seed mix May through September that are blooming. We're learning about, we don't want to disturb those areas. They're going through succession. So next, just to the right of the meadowlark is a kind of a first year seeding. It comes up in annual plants. It doesn't look very pretty. We get phone calls saying, hey, you need to do something. Well, no, succession's taking place. And then a few years later, you can see down where the arrow's pointing, just a beautiful, diverse prairie. And that all those flowers produce insects, which are needed for our wildlife. Think of pheasants, ground nesting species, etc. And then we use fire and grazing. And I think the challenge for our managers is don't think of them separately. Let's use fire to move grazing animals, which was historic. When the fires came, the bison, elk followed the fires, and we're trying to recouple that fire grazing interaction. I think eventually we'll maybe even move into bison. But I'll stop there. Brandon, next slide. Core work. Brandon touched on this. I think for time's sake, we won't be time for questions. I won't go into this more, but this is work that really informs our management, our season, our hunting season management. It's all that the work that goes on, kind of that's not often recognized. And I don't think I need to say more. Brandon, you did a good job on that. Next slide, please. Yep, and then Brandon hit on this too, where we don't always recognize this, but facility management. I don't have to read it off here. You look at the number, just the linear miles of WMA boundary region 4 alone. We have over 270 water control structures. With the flooding we had, right? They all need to be out and checked and very checked regularly. So that's a big workload for our staff, but it's it's important and critical work regardless. And then just a lot of parking lots and roads and what I would add, I'm kind of known for our staff as being a stickler in our facilities, especially our parking lots. And I always say first impressions. And I'm a firm believer you can have the best managed forest or the best managed prairie looking beautiful, but if your parking lot doesn't look maintained right, that just gives the impression to the public that our lands are not managed and cared for. So I'm kind of a stickler on good looking parking lots. I'm kind of known in Region 4 as getting on our staff on that. Anyways, Brandon, next slide. Yeah, then, just providing quality outdoor recreation. I don't need to, talk about all these slides. And that's really the hard work we do all year round. Really, it bears us out in outdoor recreation. And if that means, photography with all the shorebirds coming in on a shell lake that's in drawdown and has lots of mud flats, or foraging for mushrooms and berries, or pheasant hunting. We're, I think, becoming a destination point for pheasant hunters. Why travel to South Dakota when you have very high pheasant numbers here in the southwest part of the state? We have fantastic waterfowl hunting during the migration. We work hard on having our wetlands have a lot of food in them. And if you have wetlands that have food for waterfowl, you're going to have waterfowl. It's kind of that simple of an equation. So, Brandon, next slide. And this one is here just kind of talk about things a little bit. I got bison and the elk, and I know the elk photo there is a little bit blurry, but that elk photo was actually taken 2 weeks ago on Sanborn AMA, Aquatic Management Area, just a little bit west of where I'm sitting here in New Ulm, Minnesota. And I'll start with elk. We are actually seeing more elk in the Southwest. Now, I'm not saying we're going to have a resident elk herd, but a few years ago, we would have said, oh, that must be an escape. It got all the pens somewhere. And we're finding out, no, that's not the case. I think we have actually, it's pretty common to have, especially bull elk moving through Region 4. And we think they're coming from Nebraska. Nebraska actually has a up and coming elk herd, and some of those elk are actually moving out into the more eastern parts of Nebraska. So I think we're actually going to see more elk kick out and move through the southwest part of the state. And then obviously, if we've had the Region 1 and Region 2 call on, right, you got the elk herd up in the northwest part of the state. And we are looking at the relocation project to move elk into the Cloquet area up in Region 2. I threw bison in here because, right, elk and bison would have been the native herbivores or grazers on the prairie, and they really help shape the prairie. Bison, if folks don't know it, are actually the Minnesota State Park partnering with the zoo and some tribal governments. We have are actually bringing bison back on some of our state parks. It's not because, oh, bison are cool. It's actually to restore the genetic diversity, the true bison genetics, and that's what it's about. We need to grow that herd more to actually do a genetic rescue of that species. We actually were inbred with cattle back in the day, the bottleneck when we exterminated most of them. But what we need to do now is grow that herd so we can kind of get the genetics. And I do think our wildlife management area system can play a role for bison conservation moving forward in the future. And then I think it's significant because then we really can tie the ecological forces that shape the prairie, that fire grazing system. And cattle, we use cattle today, but I think bison will bring about some changes that we're really just not even aware of today, put it that way. And then the other ones are on the right. You can see the top is a mountain lion moving through on trail camera, and then a bobcat. And I'll start with the bobcats. Brandon talked about that. We are getting more reports. We actually got a report of a car-killed bobcat south of Windham yesterday. So we got the carcass. We're going to, Brandon said we're going to do, get it up, look at the DNA, kind of look at the origins. Is it coming from Iowa, northern Minnesota? We do have a resident bobcat population in Region 4, especially in our river areas, but very, very secretive. Um, we get them on trail cameras. But when I go to the cougar or mountain lion there in the top photo, we'll probably get about 6 verified reports of, maybe the same animal in some cases, but of cougars moving through Minnesota. And again, it's the explosion of trail cameras on the landscape. But I think what it is in South Dakota or North, South Dakota, and Nebraska, we have a very high density cougar population. So if you're a young male, most likely you cannot fit into that territorial system. And then those young cats disperse and are kicked east. And then they hit either the Missouri River bed or other river systems, and that brings them into Minnesota. And then they'll show up on trail camera. So I think just last year we had a young male, a 2-year-old male that was ear tagged as a kitten from the Pine Ridge area, Nebraska, was hit by a car on 394 in the Twin Cities area. So again, we'll get those reports. And back in my career, I used to dismiss them. Oh, you saw something else. Now it's like, okay, and we record it. And but it's all sub-adult males kicking out. So Brandon, next slide. And this is how we do our work. I just can't say enough. We don't work alone. We do our best work when we work with our conservation partners. And again, it's can't say it enough. It's a team effort. So you got our habitat and restoration. And if you really look at Hallmark in 2008 was a game changer with the passage of the Clean Water and Legacy Amendment in 2008. And that literally will bring there was 4 different funds created, but the Out There Heritage Fund and approved by the Lassard Sam's Out There Heritage Council. So literally today we'll have millions of dollars, coming to the Minnesota DNR that we can disperse throughout the regions that do habitat work, restoration, protection, and enhancement work, and our WMAs. So we're able to do things that I never dreamed of in my career with that funding source. And a subshoot of that is also the Conservation Partner Legacy Grant Program, which is also part of that Out There Heritage funding. And people on the call are interested. There's traditional, there's expedited, but there are great ways to do the work on the landscape. You can see the links on the right. And that clean water account also drives a lot of our land acquisitions. Our partners are instrumental in that. Nature Conservancy, Great River Greening, Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Trust for Public Lands. I know I'm for not mentioning them all again, but right, they can also go out and acquire land and then donate that to the state of Minnesota as either a wildlife management area or an aquatic management area. And then last but not least, we have our Adopt a WMA program. And you got the link in. Again, a fabulous program. You can be just a one-person volunteer. You can be a chapter. You can be a club, but you can take over and adopt a WMA. You can do facility work. You can do habitat work. Whatever inspires you, motivates you, we have a program. And within our regions, and I think within Region 3, we have, I want to say we have 3 or 4 counties where we actually have Pheasants Forever chapters that are doing all our facility management. Think about that. All our parking lots, our WMA signs is being done by volunteers. And that means we can put our efforts elsewhere on habitat work. So a great program up and coming. Again, take advantage of the link. Brandon, next slide. Yeah, and talk about wildlife. August 15th. Mark your calendars, everyone. August 15th. And we always say you can stop by and talk with our area wildlife staff at any time. But this is a day that we are setting aside where our staff are going to make sure they're in the office to talk with you. So we want people to stop by or give us a call. And so we're going to be there from 10 a.m. in the morning to 6 o'clock at night on August 15th. And again, this link has been up a few times, but you can just see I'm focusing on Region 3 and 4 and how to get a hold of us and the phone numbers. So take advantage of that. Reach out to your wildlife staff, not just on that day, at any time. Brandon, I think next slide, and I think we're getting to the end. Yeah, the thank you slide, and you can see our contact information down there at the end. That's true for all wildlife employees. First name, last name at state.mn.us. And I think I'm going to take a pause there, a drink of water, and we're going to answer some questions.
Awesome job, guys. We'll leave that last slide up just for a minute, Brandon, and they can jot down your email addresses if they would like, getting a few thumbs up. And we did get a few questions coming in. So let's see here. Wiped wants to know, we have seen many studies recently on the benefits of water, etc. by beavers. Do you consider them for your area too? What are your guys' beaver control? Oh, Brandon, you're muted.
Sorry about that. And I can touch on that. And beavers are super beneficial. You know, there's been some really cool research from northern Minnesota that, you know, about the percentage of the landscape that's hydrologically impacted by beavers in like Voyager National Park, and it's upwards of 20%. And, you know, they're, in addition to being what we call landscape engineers, you know, they shape, you know, there's not a lot of species that shape their environment around them to fit their needs. People are one of them, and beavers are another great example. And so we really do love beavers in the right places. They can obviously cause some real challenges, you know, with some of their activities as well. And so we are pretty careful about when we do our beaver removal and stuff like that. It's pretty targeted to when they're causing problems with like water control structures and flooding. But they are also they're one of the original fur bearer resources that, you know, some of the earliest economies in this country were built upon too. So they're a great, in addition to having some cool ecological properties, they're also a great resource for trappers as well. So
Okay, I think everybody's had a chance to jot down your emails. So we'll go ahead and shut down the presentation. And that way everybody gets to see a big picture of you guys. I'm going to apologize to Jeff for his difficulty in getting logged into WebEx. It happens from time to time, but I think Benji's got you taken care of. Let's see here. Mary lives in Rice County, and I've seen negative effects of exotic alien earthworms, which is all of them. Minnesota has no native earthworms. There are little to no understory and hardwood forest. What do the speakers see in their work? What kinds of mitigation and or adaptation are possible?
Yeah, I can take a stab with that. Yeah, I mean, I must admit it was not that long ago when I didn't realize. I mean, as a kid, I was digging up earthworms for fishing, and I didn't realize they weren't even native, right? You know, and so Mary, I think that really gets down to education. Once those earthworms are established, I want to say I'm getting out a little bit on a branch here. I do think there are researchers looking at, are there ways we can kind of minimize and mitigate that? That kind of keep them from marching throughout that understory. But you are right; they can drastically change the understory of the forest. Then that has cascading effects. So, spot on with that. But I really think what it comes down to is just public education. That when you're done with bait, that you don't dump your worms out, into the backyard, if you will, which I think was common practice. You know, proper disposal of your bait. And I also think. It's just education as well on exporting animals into the state, the right rules and regulations to kind of prevent the import of even other species. And it could be for, not only for first fishing purposes, but for just, for other reasons and stuff too. So I really think it's going to come down to just a lot of education on people and making them aware of the implications that you are seeing firsthand. It's a great question.
Good deal. I think this one's directed towards you too, David. It says from Fran, have you heard of any mountain lions nesting in the state? I volunteer at the fair in the wildlife wing, and someone told me as a couple of years ago that he had found a den in central Minnesota. Or do you think that they will begin breeding in the state? I read that 2 were spotted together this winter in central Minnesota.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So to start off at the first part, right now we have no evidence of a breeding population of cougars in Minnesota, right? Everything that we have seen so far has been solitary males moving through the state. So again, as of today, no confirmed, or no breeding population of cougars in the state. Um, Now I'm gonna tread a little bit lighter here. Now, 10 years from now, I'm not so sure. And I have a running bet with our fur bearer biologist, John Erb, on what the future holds for cougars in Minnesota. Again, right now it's solitary males kicking out, but will we build densities where we have a lone female and stuff? So we'll see what the future brings. I would say if that were to happen, again, we have no evidence it is right now. The Minnesota DNR has no plans to, if you will, start a cougar population. But if it were to occur on its own naturally, it'd probably be up in northern Minnesota. But like you, we hear stories of that. We hear people saying, "Oh, we a cougar with kittens." But again, when you go out there and you press them for it, when you go out there and ask for the photos or track evidence, you just never get that. So again, everything we know of today, no breeding population of cougars, everything is solitary males moving through the state. But great question.
Yeah. So you got a few minutes here to get your questions in. The last one is from Gene, and Gene wants to know if this is recorded. And all of our Moss segments are recorded. They get closed captioned and put up on the DNR YouTube channel, and you can access those from our webpage. If you do a search for outdoor skills and stewardship on the DNR page, it'll bring you to upcoming events, and there's a tab you can click for recording. And we have 171 episodes out there now for you guys to go back and check over. I don't see any more questions. Oh, here's one. From our favorite viewer, Jeff. What have been the impacts on wildlife from our recent extreme weather, 3 years of drought and recent flooding?
Yeah, I can start with that one and then have Brandon take that over. But yeah, Jeff, you're right. 2 years of drought. And um, so drought and wet cycles are part of really what shaped the prairie. And so I'm going to be real region 4 centric here a little bit in the west part of region 1. But drought and wet cycles go hand in hand, and that really drives the ecology. So when I look at 2 years of drought, we're actually coming off a very wet decade, and we had 2 years of drought. That actually benefited our area from an ecology standpoint. A lot of our shallow lakes were had too much water. So finally, during drought conditions, either we were able to do managed drawdowns, again, less water, mud flats, reset the hydrology, the cycle, or they went through a natural drawdown on their own, and great benefits to a lot of our wetlands. And I actually think drought really drives some of our prairie plant systems too, that maybe in ways we don't understand. So life is pretty good. But as everyone knows, right, and then the rains came to spring, and the climate is giving us more precipitation flat out. If you talk to our state climatologists, we're getting wetter. And we're seeing that. I mean, our rain events now, I just in Springfield, we had another shower come in, and I would say probably 2.5 inches in a few minutes. It was just, it looked like a monsoonal rain. So the climate is giving us really, literally billions of gallons of additional water. And so, yeah, I mean, it was too much water. So in the Southwest, there were some of our WMAs that were just totally underwater. And again, that will save the wetlands. So I'm telling people, hey, in the future, we got to move wildlife to higher ground. I mean, so some of our WMAs are totally underwater. It's hard to produce wildlife. So, short being, it was right during the nesting season. So I do think our pheasant numbers aren't going to be very good down in the Southwest. I actually think it was too much water for some of our ducks. And I know we're doing fawn survival research out of Bedelia, and we actually had some fawns that drowned due to this event as well. And then again, all that water going into our rivers and streams, right? You saw what happened on the Rapidan Dam, the erosion. So there is a true ecological cost to all this billions of gallons of additional water coming in. And I think that's the challenge that we have as society, is how to hold that water on the landscape. And I'll flat out, I think Brandon would agree, all of us, our WMAs, our public lands, play a role in holding water on the landscape. And we might think of them as great places to do outdoor recreation, oh, pheasants, deer, but really it's that ecological, the ecosystem services that our public lands provide in groundwater and floodwater protection. I really think that's a story that we need to tell more of to the public on the benefits of public lands and that ecological benefit that those types of systems have. So I'll stop on at that point here. Brandon, I don't know if you want to add to it in your area. But
No, I think you did a pretty good job, Dave. And one thing that I will say is, like, when we get these kind of, much larger, more frequent rain events like we're experiencing now, I think it was 2016 was a similar year, based on my recollection for checking water control structures at the time. But one thing that can be a real challenge is, we're managing these, we try and restore these systems on our wildlife areas to a natural state, but we're really not, like, at a landscape level, it's really not a natural environment anymore. And, the way that our hydrology works in particular, whether it's the 7,000 miles of ditches and drain tiling, is we get that water coming off a lot faster in a lot greater quantities and moving through the system, which can make it more difficult to manage the areas that are in more of a natural state too. But like Dave said, those ecosystem services, not just holding water on the landscape, but that water is oftentimes nutrient rich and helping filter those nutrients out, through vegetative growth, so that the water quality in our downstream systems is improved, is another benefit. We're buying these areas for wildlife habitat and outdoor recreation, but they provide so much more. So.
Okay, we got one final question, and we've got just a little over 5 minutes to answer it. I was saving this one towards the end because it might be pretty in depth. It's from Lisa, and she wants to know, do you envision the Supreme Court Chevron decision to affect your work?
yeah, now the Chevron decision, I did hear about that on the radio, and I'm just gonna pause here to get my thoughts on that case. Oh yeah, that was a case. So folks that aren't familiar with it, the Chevron basically said when it comes to and litigation where there's a lawsuit, the Chevron ruling kind of stated that the state agency or the federal agency would kind of get the nod, if you will, as being the technical experts on the matter. So, if you will, there was a little bit larger burden of proof required, if you will, to overturn a state or federal ruling. And I'm maybe butchering that a little bit. But the Chevron case that just happened in the Supreme Court overturned that. So I think the that question is profound. I do think, and actually on the radio show or broadcast I was listening to, there was a number of things on a regulatory litigation standpoint that were going to be coming in the pipeline that would, potentially impact the way we especially do wetland conservation work and other conservation work throughout the United States. So I think it is a very significant ruling, and just kudos to the caller to being aware of that. If your others are not aware, and apparently I need to even brush up on it even more, stay tuned, because I think we could see a lot more litigation coming in the pipeline, and then that just adds even more uncertainty how we move through, especially on the federal end. And if you think of the waters of the United States, we've been wrestling with that, the federal government and the Corps of Engineers over the waters of the United States for probably a decade now. and that just causes a lot of confusion. In the meantime, you get wetland loss and stuff like that. So I'll stop there. Great question though.
Okay, and Tony wants to know, what are some of the non-game wildlife projects going on in the southwest part of the state?
Yeah, non-game staff, they're different division, but nonetheless, they're doing great work. They got a lot of monitoring going on right now for different pollinators. They're going out and doing transects, looking at the number of bees, number of butterflies, really to kind of get our baseline stuff. There's a tremendous amount of research going on with bees in general. I know Mike Warland, his non-game program, is doing breeding bird, surveys throughout Region 4. We got long-term research going on different snake species, blandings, turtles, and other species. I think there's a research going on looking at bats on the prairie, which we know very little about. And there's also some work going on looking at American kestrels. And I think I'm just hitting the highlight of that. There's just a lot of other non-game work going on. And again, all this public land, like I always tell people, wildlife doesn't read signs. So game, non-game, whatever, habitat is habitat to wildlife. And the more we have of habitat on the landscape, the more wildlife we're going to have. It's really that simple of an equation. So thank you.
Okay, and the last question that I can see here is from Margaret. She wants to know if mining for sand and gravel have an impact on groundwater retention and flood mitigation.
That's a Region 3 question.
I was going to say, that's a great question, and it's a little bit outside my area of expertise and purview. Those are some, we have specific groundwater hydrologists through much of the state. When I was in southeast Minnesota in the Rochester area, these were some pretty hot topics because of the karst geology that's there. The groundwater is particularly susceptible to contamination and has some other challenges, but we do have a lot of great specialists and groundwater specialists in particular with our Division of Ecological and Water Resources that could do a much better job of answering that question than I could.
Okay. That looks like all the questions. We had a suggestion for an upcoming episode on bringing a non-game specialist in. So thank you for that. And I just want to remind everyone that this is recorded and we'll have it probably up by Monday of next week. And tune in next week for episode 172 when we tackle birding 101. Guys, thank you so much. Cassie, if you could take us back to the green room. Thank you again.
Thank you.